Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Donovan, for your presence here today. In an article in The Guardian in 2011, you said that the IMF was open to rescheduling of debt, whereas the EU was muddling through, as it hadn't been involved in such bailouts before. Just in the first part of that sentence, the rescheduling of debt, was it previously IMF policy, when engaging in a rescue, to reschedule, restructure or burn bondholders?
The IMF, if I may say so, I think in general has been more open to the concept of restructuring and debt in general, particularly sovereign debt. And many IMF programs, as I think I mentioned in my response to Deputy Higgins earlier, have in fact included this as a very substantial part, because otherwise the numbers don't add up. You can't put the thing together unless creditors take a hit. And this is a long-standing feature of IMF programs. But it's not a general principle that always has to apply. You look at each particular country because there are costs associated with debt write-downs. Countries' reputations suffer. If you can get away with doing it, it's possibly better. But if it's inevitable that there's no solution other than including that, the IMF are pragmatic and say, let's do it, and they would probably say, let's do it sooner rather than later, because we're just postponing the inevitable. Now, the Europeans, I hesitate to speak for too much for Europeans, but I think various places I've made the observation that the ECB was perhaps less reluctant, well, not wasn't, was perhaps, was, and perhaps always been, very reluctant to entertain too much debt write-downs and restructuring. Why is that? Well, I think the IMF has a lot of experience on what works and doesn't work over 50 years, and it sees what may have to be done sooner. The ECB is a young institution. It's clearly wishing to safeguard its reputation and having to preside over debt write-downs on an institution that's 10 years old, banks, losses and whatever, or bank write-downs, isn't something that would fit too easily with a central bank, a new institution that is seeking to enhance its reputation. I think the view might also be said by some in Europe who would oppose debt write-downs, at least the ECB, would be say, well, it's okay for the IMF to say, well, you should probably do this and it'll work, things will work out better. But what if the IMF is wrong and the costs associated with this turn out to be much higher than anybody had thought, or that the IMF had said might be the case? Well, the IMF people can always get back into their aeroplanes and go back to Washington. But the ECB will be the institution which would have to remain to pick up the pieces if the strategy didn't work. So for that reason, perhaps there's an element of conservatism on the part of the ECB.
Is it unusual, though, for that approach to rescheduling not to be taken in this context, in the Irish context? Is it unusual for the US Treasury to step in and I suppose, change the normal approach of the IMF?
I think really every country is different, and what happened in Ireland and what was happening in the euro area was unprecedented in the history of the IMF and even in the world. We had a currency union, we had lending for the first time ever to a member of a currency union. We had extraordinary circumstances as to what was the debt, what was the size of the debt. We had systemic failure, we had worldwide panic, we had Lehman Brothers, we had contagion. All of these things were unprecedented in the history of the IMF. So I don't think it was a question of taking a standard cookie-cutter approach and just applying it to Ireland. It couldn't be and it shouldn't be.
Away then from the concept of restructuring and just looking at the approach from, say, the EU and the IMF in terms of the actual bailout terms. If we look at the difference in the terms, the IMF loan was provided over a longer period of 10 years and at a rate of 3.1%, whereas the EU loans were to be repaid over a period of 7.5 years at a rate of 5.9%.
I can't speak about the rationale of the financing terms associated with the EU component, although I understand, if my memory is correct, that when the rescue fund was set up, the idea was that it would be the cost of borrowing the funds from the markets, so forever, plus a margin, I think, of maybe 1% to cover administrative costs or risks or something like that. And that just produced a number. Subsequently, that formula was changed very substantially, if I'm correct, in the case of Greece. And the administrative margin was eliminated, and there was another way of looking at it, and this had the effect of lowering the cost. Now, these are essentially political decisions by the EU. The case of the IMF is a bit different. There is one formula which applies to all countries, there's a slight difference between very poor countries and others. But essentially, there's a formula applied to all countries. It's not a political decision. It's not a question of people saying in the IMF, well, what will we charge Ireland or what will we charge Iceland or Greece? No, it's a standard formula. And it's based on the average, I think, of Treasury bill rates in current and prospective, with a margin.
Now you're going to have to finish up. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Just because I'm limited in my time. You mentioned in your opening statement about, why the IMF might not be more explicit when it came to sounding the warning bell for Ireland. And you said that there could have been pressures both in the IMF and vis-à-vis the authorities to dismiss the possibility of such very negative outcomes. You say that on page 8 of your opening statement. I know you're exploring possibilities, but do you raise that as a possibility because you encountered it yourself in your own work in other countries? And then further to that, when we look at the actual reports coming from the IMF, what we do see is that they did identify a number of the shortcomings and the dangers, as did the ESRI. But when it came to the actual reports coming out after the Executive Board had seen them, we also see this idea that they're commending the impressive performance and they're talking about a soft landing. So there's a kind of two parts to that question, the idea of interference that you might have experienced, and then what can we read into that, the two messages coming out of the IMF reports, vis-à-vis what the staff were seeing on the ground, but what then the Executive Board were reporting back to the government.
Mr. Donovan?
This is a very tricky area. I think the IMF staff do not work in a vacuum, nor can they work in a vacuum. They're not just purely technocrats who are not aware of what judgments are being made, what weights people put on risks occurring, catastrophes happening or not, as the case may be. And it would be unusual, let me put it this way, for the IMF report to say that a country is doing very well, and then for that report to go to the Executive Board and for many directors at the board to say, no, the IMF is completely wrong, that country is doing very badly. Or in the opposite direction, it would be difficult for the IMF to say that everything is going, very badly, and the board to say, no, the staff is completely exaggerating the risks, the costs, they don't understand, it's going very well. No, there is a certain, not say convergence, but there is a certain way in which views of board members can and probably should influence to some extent, albeit somewhat subconsciously perhaps, what the staff will write. There's no instructions from the board, there's no question of censorship, but we're all human beings and we get a sense of what the general line of thinking is on a country, and that has to exert some, I think, subtle influence. Now, mind you, on the board there are differences of view, often on a particular case, and the staff has to sort of navigate a way through those different views. The staff itself will have different views among each other, and sometimes analytical issues and possibilities are discussed quite openly, but when it comes to the final sort of nuanced judgment, and adjectives often matter, because adjectives are what get reported in the media, and some of the sentences on those reports are very subtle.
A level of repetition and moving on.